Doctor had studied 17 sapient species across the galaxy. They had watched civilizations rise and fall, observed countless worlds struggle against the cold indifference of the universe. In all their centuries of research, they had never encountered anything quite like humanity. The researchers stood at the observation window of their cloaked shuttle, looking down at the blue and green planet below. Earth was beautiful from orbit, but knew better than to be fooled by pretty colors. Their preliminary reports painted a grim picture. Climate disasters had swallowed coastlines whole. Wars over water and food had left deep scars across every continent. Billions of humans lived in conditions that would have broken most species. According to every model in the Galactic Emotional Sciences Institute, Earth should have been a world of silence and despair. When sapient beings suffered this much for this long, they always followed the same pattern. First came the withdrawal from community. Then came the emotional collapse. Finally came the slow death of civilization itself. They had gone that way. So had the crystalline singers of Vega 7. Suffering, it seemed, was the universe's most effective weapon against hope. But the readings from Earth made no sense at all. Adjusted the shuttle's sensors for the 100th time, certain there must be an error in the equipment. The emotional signature of the planet should have registered as a flat gray line of despair. Instead, the instruments showed something impossible. Bright spikes of joy erupted from the surface like solar flares. Laughter echoed from cities that should have been silent with grief. Even in the places where suffering was worst, humans were somehow generating positive emotional energy. They were laughing. Requested permission to establish a research station on Earth's surface. The Institute granted it immediately. This was exactly the kind of anomaly that demanded study. If humans had discovered some way to resist the emotional entropy that claimed all other species, the galaxy needed to understand how. The Joy Research Station was hidden inside an abandoned satellite facility in what the humans called South America. Chose the location carefully. The nearby megacity of had experienced some of the worst flooding on the planet. Half the old city now lay underwater, and millions of humans lived in crowded towers built on the ruins. If the research team wanted to study joy in the face of darkness, this was the perfect place. Two other researchers joined on Earth. The first was Al, a senior scientist with gray scales and a permanently skeptical expression. Al had spent 300 years studying emotional dysfunction across the galaxy. They believed they already knew what they would find on Earth. "It is a coping malfunction," Al declared during their first team meeting. "The humans are experiencing a collective break from reality. Their minds cannot process the severity of their situation, so they have retreated into false happiness. We will document the mechanism, publish our findings, and return home within 6 months." The second researcher was a young empath with iridescent skin that shifted colors with their emotions. Unlike the other, empaths could feel the emotions of other beings directly. This made them invaluable for research, but also vulnerable. The Institute required empaths to wear dampening filters at all times when studying other species. Raw exposure to alien emotions could be overwhelming, even dangerous. Skin flickered with nervous purple as they asked the question that would change everything. If human joy is merely a malfunction, why does it feel so different from madness? Al had no answer for that. Neither did they would have to find one. Their first research subject was a human female named Maria Santos. She was 47 years old, according to Earth's measurements. She worked during the day as a sanitation engineer in the flood districts, wading through contaminated water to keep the city's filtration systems running. It was dangerous, dirty work. The humans who did it rarely lived past 60. But Maria Santos did something else at night. She ran a comedy show. The researchers observed from a distance as Maria opened the doors to a half-submerged theater in the old downtown. Water lapped at the first 3 rows of seats, and the walls were streaked with mold. The electrical system ran on illegal power taps that sparked and flickered. By any reasonable measure, This was not a place where joy should exist. Yet humans came anyway. They arrived by boat and by foot, climbing through flooded streets to reach the theater. They were young and old, sick and healthy, rich and poor. Some had lost homes in the floods. Others had lost family members. All of them had lost the future they once imagined for themselves. Maria Santos stood on the stage, ankle-deep in brown water, and made them laugh. Recorded every moment, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Maria told stories about her job, about the absurdity of swimming through sewage to fix pumps that would break again tomorrow. She described the bureaucrats who sent her equipment that was always the wrong size, the forms she had to fill out in triplicate just to requisition a new pair of boots. She complained about her aching back, her terrible supervisor, the endless parade of small frustrations that made up her daily life. None of this should have been funny. It was a catalog of suffering and indignity. But Maria's voice carried a particular rhythm, her timing precise and devastating. She built each story to a peak of absurdity, then released the tension with a twist that somehow made the audience erupt with laughter. The sound filled the flooded theater like light filling a dark room. "I do not understand," Al said, their voice tight with confusion. "She is describing genuine hardship. These humans should be weeping, not laughing." But understood, even through the dampening filters. The young empath's skin had turned a color that had never seen before. It was warm and bright and entirely new. "They are not laughing because they have forgotten their pain," said softly. "They are laughing because they remember it perfectly." After the show, arranged a private interview with Maria Santos. They used a holographic disguise to appear human, a standard precaution for first contact studies. Maria met them in a small room behind the stage, surrounded by worn props and water-stained costumes. She was smaller up close than she had seemed on stage. Her hands were rough from work, and her face carried the lines of someone who had weathered many storms. But her eyes were bright and curious, and she smiled easily. "You are researchers," Maria said. It was not a question. Felt a moment of alarm. Had their disguise failed somehow? Maria laughed at their expression. "Relax. I can always tell the academics. You watch everything like you are trying to solve a puzzle, so what do you want to know?" Decided to be direct. "We want to understand how you can laugh when there is so much suffering. Our models predict that prolonged hardship should lead to emotional collapse. Yet you and your audience seem to experience genuine joy. How is this possible?" Maria was quiet for a long moment. She looked out the window at the flooded street, where a family was paddling by in a small boat, their children trailing their fingers in the water. "When I was young," she said finally, "my grandmother told me a story. She survived a terrible time in our country's history. People disappeared in the night. Everyone was afraid. But even then," she said, "people would gather in secret to tell jokes. They laughed at the dictators. They laughed at the soldiers. They laughed at death itself." Maria turned back too, and her eyes held something the researcher could not name. "My grandmother told me that laughing was how they stayed alive. Not just their bodies, but the parts of them that mattered most. The parts that could still hope, still love, still dream. The dictators could take everything else, but they could not take the laughter. It was the one thing that belonged only to the people." Recorded every word, but they knew that mere data could not capture what Maria was describing. This was something deeper than psychology. It was survival of a different kind. "The floods took my husband," Maria continued. "They took my home, my savings, my plans for the future, but they did not take my voice. They did not take my stories. And as long as I can stand on that stage and make people laugh, I am not beaten." She smiled, and for just a moment, the research station's sensors registered an impossible spike in positive emotional energy. It was brighter than anything in the archives. "We laugh because we are still here," Maria said. "And as long as we are still here, we are winning." Left the interview with more questions than answers. They returned to the research station and began writing a preliminary report to the Institute. The words came slowly, because the truth was difficult to express in scientific terms. Humanity was not malfunctioning. They were fighting a war that they had never even known existed. And somehow, impossibly, they were winning. 6 months passed, and the research team collected more data than any previous study in Institute history. They 847 distinct forms of human humor, from simple wordplay to elaborate satirical performances. They documented jokes in every human language, from every culture, from every corner of the planet. And still, they could not fully explain what they were witnessing. Al's hypothesis grew weaker with each new observation. The senior researcher had argued that human humor was a form of psychological anesthesia, a way of numbing themselves to pain. But the data told a different story. Humans who laughed most frequently did not show lower awareness of their circumstances. They showed higher awareness. They knew exactly how bad things were. They laughed anyway. This defies all established models, Al complained during one evening meeting. The correlation should be negative. Increased awareness of suffering should decrease positive emotional output. Instead, we see the opposite effect. It is as if these humans are using their understanding of darkness to generate light. Had been thinking about this problem for weeks. They had reviewed recordings of Maria's comedy shows dozens of times, trying to identify the moment when pain transformed into laughter. It always seemed to happen at the same point in her stories, right after she described something terrible, but before she delivered what the humans called a punchline. There is a pivot, observed. Maria takes the audience to the edge of despair, then turns them away from it. The laughter comes from the turning, not from the destination. Al flicked their tail in frustration. But why should turning away from despair produce such intense positive emotion? In every other species we have studied, the acknowledgement of hopelessness leads only to deeper hopelessness. There is no pivot. There is no turning. The answer came from an unexpected source. Had been growing increasingly restless over the past months. The young empath spent more and more time observing human gatherings, always pushing at the edges of what their dampening filters would allow. During team meetings, their skin shifted through colors that the other researchers could not identify. Something was changing in, something that made both curious and concerned. One night, slipped out of the research station without permission. They found their way to Maria's theater and removed their dampening filters entirely. It was a serious violation of Institute protocols. It was also necessary. The comedy show that night was one of Maria's best. She told a story about her husband, a man named Carlos who had died in the floods 3 years ago. She described his terrible cooking, his even worse singing, his habit of leaving wet towels on the bed. She made the audience see him clearly, this imperfect man who had shared her life for 20 years. Then Maria described the night he died, the water rising in their apartment, Carlos pushing her toward the emergency ladder, insisting she climb first, the sound of the building collapsing before she could reach back for him. The theater was silent. Even the water seemed to stop lapping at the seats. Then Maria said something about Carlos's singing, something about how even drowning, he probably would not have been able to carry a tune. The punchline was absurd and perfect and devastating, and it should not have been funny, but suddenly the audience was laughing through their tears. They were laughing because they understood. They were laughing because they had all lost someone. They were laughing because laughter was the only thing strong enough to hold that much grief. Felt it all without filters. The sorrow crashed over them like a wave, followed immediately by something else. It was not just joy. It was defiance. It was a collective refusal to let death have the final word. It was an act of rebellion against the very nature of the universe. The empath's skin turned a color that had no name in language. It was beautiful and terrible and entirely new. Found outside the theater an hour later, sitting on a broken bench and staring at the stars. The young empath's filters lay discarded at their feet. Their skin still shimmered with that impossible new color. "You should not have done that," said quietly. "Unfiltered exposure to concentrated human emotion could cause permanent changes to your neural patterns." Looked up at their supervisor with eyes that seemed somehow different than before. Older, perhaps, or younger. It was hard to tell. "I understand now," said. "The laughter is not about forgetting pain. It is not about denying reality. It is about refusing to let pain define reality." Sat down on the bench beside them. The night air was warm and humid, and the sounds of the city drifted across the water. Somewhere in the distance, someone was playing music. "Explain it to me," said. Was quiet for a long moment, searching for words that could bridge the gap between understanding and human experience. When Maria told that story about her husband, she was not running away from grief. She was walking straight into it. She took the audience with her, all the way to the worst moment of her life. But then she turned. She found something absurd in the middle of the tragedy, something that did not belong there. "The joke about his singing," said. "Yes, but it was more than a joke. It was a choice. Maria chose to see Carlos as a complete person, full of flaws and ridiculousness, even in the moment of his death. She refused to let that moment erase everything else he was. And when the audience laughed, they made the same choice. They said no to the universe. They said that death does not own our memories. They said that love is stronger than loss." Considered this for a long time. It was a concept that had no equivalent in philosophy. Their species had always viewed consciousness as subject to universal forces. Entropy increased, suffering accumulated, hope faded. These were laws as fixed as gravity. But humans seemed to operate under different laws entirely. "You said they were refusing something," said finally. "Refusing to let pain define reality. Is that what the laughter means? Is it an act of refusal?" Skin flickered with warmth. Not just refusal, defiance. The universe wants to break them. Every moment of suffering is the universe saying that they do not matter, that their dreams do not matter, that their love does not matter. The laughter is their answer. It says that they matter anyway. It says that they will find joy anyway. It says that they will keep fighting anyway. Sat with this truth, letting it settle into their understanding. It was revolutionary. It was dangerous. It was possibly the most important discovery in the history of. The next day, they arranged an interview with an elderly human named Harold. Harold was 93 years old and living in a care facility built from converted shipping containers. He had been a professional comedian for 70 years, performing in clubs and theaters across the old world, until the floods made most of those places unlivable. Now Harold spent his days in a small room with a window that looked out on gray water. His body was failing. His memory came and went. But when asked him about laughter, his eyes lit up with a fire that seemed to burn through all his years. "You want to know the secret," Harold said, grinning with missing teeth. "I will tell you the secret. The universe wants me dead. It has always wanted me dead. Every day I wake up, I am winning a battle against forces that would rather I did not exist." He leaned forward in his chair, and his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "So every time I laugh, I am telling the universe to wait its turn. I am saying that I am not finished yet. I am saying that even if I die tomorrow, today I am alive and today I choose joy. That is the only real power any of us have. We cannot stop the darkness from coming, but we can refuse to let it into our hearts." Transmitted their preliminary findings to the Institute that night. The response came within hours, immediate recall of all research personnel. The High Council had reviewed the data, and they were alarmed. Human humor appeared to be contagious. Several junior researchers at the home base had begun exhibiting strange symptoms after reading the transcripts from Earth. They made comments that seemed designed to provoke laughter. They began gathering in small groups to share absurd stories. One of them had even produced what could only be described as a joke. And the empath who had exposed themselves to unfiltered human emotion had fundamentally changed. They were making jokes constantly now. Their skin displayed colors that had never appeared in recorded history. When senior researchers expressed concern, simply laughed and said that concern was the universe's way of keeping people from having fun. The Institute was terrified. If human humor could spread across species barriers, if it could alter the fundamental emotional architecture of other sapient beings, then Earth might represent the most significant memetic hazard ever discovered. Some council members called for immediate quarantine. Others suggested more extreme measures. But read between the lines of the recall order and understood something that the council did not. The Institute was not just afraid of human humor. They were afraid that it might be right. Refused to leave Earth. The official recall order sat unopened in their communications buffer while they prepared for one final observation. Something was happening something that could prove or disprove everything they believed about human resilience. They would not abandon their research now. Maria Santos had sent word through her underground network. The flood district was under threat. A consortium of corporations had purchased the land rights from a desperate city government, and they planned to demolish everything to build luxury towers for the wealthy. Thousands of families would be displaced. Decades of community would be destroyed. The people who had survived floods and plagues and the collapse of the old world would finally be pushed out entirely. Most species in similar circumstances would simply accept their fate. The power imbalance was too great. The corporations had money, lawyers, and private security forces. The residents of the flood district had nothing but their flooded homes and their stubborn refusal to leave. But this was Earth, and humans had learned did not follow the rules that governed other species. Maria organized the resistance through humor. On the morning the demolition crews arrived, they found something unexpected waiting for them. Thousands of residents had gathered in the streets, but they were not carrying weapons or building barricades. They were carrying signs. The signs said things that made no sense to the confused security officers. "Drown us if you can, we're already wet." "This neighborhood smell, so bad the fish moved out first." "Our building leans more than your legal case." The protesters were laughing. They formed dance lines in the flooded streets, performing elaborate satirical routines that mocked the corporations, the government, and the absurdity of the entire situation. Someone had brought a band, and they played music that was half celebration and half funeral march. Watched from a concealed observation point, recording everything. The emotional readings were unlike anything in their archives. The protesters were genuinely afraid. They knew they might lose everything today, but their fear was threaded through with something else, something that burned like a star in the sensor data. Defiance, joy, the absolute refusal to be broken. The corporate security forces did not know how to respond. They had been trained to handle violence, resistance, and despair. They had not been trained to handle thousands of people laughing in their faces. The protesters made jokes about the guards, about their equipment, about their matching uniforms. They invited them to join the dance. They offered them food from community kitchens. Some of the guards started to smile. A few even laughed. The operation fell apart within hours. The demolition crews refused to work through crowds of singing, dancing, laughing people. The security forces could not bring themselves to use violence against such an obviously joyful gathering. The corporate executives, watching from their distant offices, saw something that terrified them more than any riot could have. They saw that they could not win against people who had already decided not to be defeated. News of the comedy uprising spread across the planet within days. Other communities adopted the same tactics. Protests became performances. Resistance became ridiculous. People who had felt hopeless for years suddenly remembered how to laugh, and that laughter became a weapon more powerful than any the corporations could deploy. The demolition was halted. The land rights were returned to the city. The flood district would survive. Transmitted their final report to the Institute from the roof of Maria's theater, watching the sunrise paint the flooded streets in gold and pink. The message was long and detailed, but its conclusion was simple. Human humor was not a hazard. It was a survival mechanism that the galaxy desperately needed. The universe was hostile. Entropy always increased. Every sapient species eventually faced the darkness that had already consumed 17 civilizations in the Institute's records. Most species responded with despair, withdrawal, and eventual collapse. They accepted the rules that the universe imposed. But humans had discovered something remarkable. They had learned that acknowledging darkness while refusing to be consumed by it created a third option: not denial, not submission, transcendence through absurdity. When humans laughed in the face of suffering, they were not pretending that the suffering did not exist. They were asserting that suffering did not own them. They were claiming a space of freedom that no external force could touch. They were saying, in the most fundamental way possible, that they chose who they wanted to be. The report recommended not quarantine but cultivation. They should not fear human humor. They should learn from it. They should study it and practice it and allow it to change them. Because the alternative was the same slow death that had claimed every other species in the records. The Institute did not respond to the report for 3 days. When the message finally came, it was not what expected. The High Council had been deadlocked until walked into their chamber and told a joke. It was a simple joke, almost childish by human standards. It involved a researcher crossing the galaxy for reasons that became absurd by the end of the telling. The council members sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Then one of them laughed. It was the first recorded instance of voluntary laughter in history. The sound was strange and awkward, but it was unmistakably real, and once one council member started, others followed. Within minutes, the chamber rang with sounds that had never echoed there before. The quarantine motion was dropped. A new research program was approved. Humanity would not be isolated from the galaxy. They would be the galaxy's teachers. Chose to remain on Earth as the first official Joy ambassador. Their skin now displayed colors that artists would spend generations trying to capture. They attended Maria's shows every week and learned to tell their own jokes, terrible ones at first but improving with practice. Al returned home, but they were changed. The senior researcher could no longer sit through institute meetings without noticing their inherent ridiculousness. The formal procedures, the bureaucratic language, the serious expressions of colleagues who had never questioned the rules of their existence. It all seemed absurd now. Al began writing papers that included jokes in the footnotes. Some of their colleagues were scandalized. Others started laughing. And stayed on Earth for 1 more month, watching and learning and recording. They attended Maria's final show of the season, standing in the back of the flooded theater while she performed for a crowd that had survived everything the universe could throw at them. Maria told a joke about the end of the world. It was dark and beautiful and absolutely true. When the punchline landed, the audience laughed so hard that their joy seemed to fill the entire building, pushing back the water, the darkness, the weight of all their losses. Understood, finally, what they had been witnessing all along. Humanity did not laugh despite the darkness. They laughed because of the darkness. They had learned that joy was not the absence of pain, but the defiant assertion of meaning in its presence. Every joke was a small revolution. Every laugh was a declaration of independence from a universe that wanted them to give up. The last line of the final report was not a conclusion but a beginning. Recommend immediate study of human construct designated gallows humor. May contain key to universal psychological resilience. Also, I believe I have identified what humans call a good one. Why did the researcher cross the galaxy? To get to the other punchline. The Institute recorded it as the first joke in history. Centuries later, When historians looked back at the moment everything changed, they would not point to a battle or a treaty or a great discovery. They would point to a flooded theater in a broken city, where a tired woman stood ankle-deep in dirty water and made people laugh. That was the moment the galaxy learned to hope again. That was the moment humanity taught the stars to smile. And somewhere, in every corner of the cosmos, beings who had never known laughter before began to understand that they had a choice. They could submit to the darkness, or they could defy it. They could accept the rules, or they could laugh in their faces. Most of them chose to laugh.